Our guest today is the president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. He has served in that position for 2 years. Prior to assuming his current role, our president today served as president of his alma mater, the University of Washington. Our guest today is a native of the state of Washington. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from the University of Washington. Also, our guest today earned both his master's degree and a PhD in Public Administration from Syracuse University. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Emmert. Mark?
Have fun up here.
Thank you. I think, is this mic working? Can you hear me in the back okay? I'm sorry, I have a bit of a raspy voice, so you're all right? You can hear back there? Okay, good. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come here today, Jay, and thanks for the introduction and letting me come to the City Club. This is obviously a club with a wonderful tradition and a great city. We were commenting as we were coming up this morning, I have always told people that if I talk to international friends about visiting the United States, it's always interesting. You talk to people from Europe or Africa and say, well, have you been to the U.S.? They'll frequently say, oh, yes, I've been to New York. And they'll often say New York and Orlando, right? And they say, right? Yeah, I've been to America. And then my Asian friends, you talk to them, have you been to the United States? Yeah, I've been to L.A. Well, I almost always will say, look, if you really want to know what America's about and you want to get a feel for America, and you can only go to one city, come to Chicago. And I really do, and I really mean that, because it embodies so much more than, New York, wonderful, wonderful city, but it's a global city in so many ways. LA is, hot tubs and Chardonnay and stuff, and it's great, but it's not, America. And whenever you're in Chicago, I love coming to Chicago because you do feel like you're really in a place that represents the amazing diversity of our country. And now I'm going to just refine my recommendation and say, come to a City Club luncheon, right? You'll learn a lot about the United States. If you ever want to come and understand American politics, for sure come to a City Club luncheon. At this table right here, I've gotten my grandkids admitted to 4 universities. I've launched a housing deal, and we've committed to bring the next 4 Final Fours in a row to Chicago with the governor. And it's all set, right? And that was in the first 10 minutes. Right? So you can kind of get a feel for what this country's all about. What I wanted to do before we get to questions, and I'd like to move to those as quickly as we can. What I thought I'd do is give you sort of an overview of where I think things stand in intercollegiate athletics today, because it's a topic that lots of people talk about and write about, and there's a lot of attention given to it, which is a great thing, but there's also a lot of misunderstandings and misapprehensions and real legitimate and sometimes not so legitimate concern about the state of college sports right now. And I think before you begin could I have my water, please? I'm sorry, I really am.
Tea or water? Which one?
Water, please. Well, scotch, but there's none there. So. You have to begin that conversation by really talking about what really is the NCAA and what's the business that it's in. Not the business, but the enterprise that it's in. And to do that, you really have to go back to our roots. Why the NCAA? What is this thing called the NCAA? A lot of people think we're somehow a government agency. Some people think we're like the NFL or the NBA. Some people think we're just an amorphous, faceless group of bureaucrats who sit in Indianapolis and never come above ground and just pass out edicts. And all of those things are dead wrong. The NCAA's roots are almost as old as college sport in America. And college sport in America has a wonderful, fascinating, rich, troubling, fun, funny history. It begins right after the Civil War. There were some colleges that were engaged in sport before the Civil War in the United States, but it was all what we would today call intramural sports. It was mostly university leaders, of which there's a number here, trying to figure out how to keep young men, because these were almost all male institutions then, out of trouble. So you got all these 18 to 22-year-old kids, and sometimes younger in American schools then, and they had all of the energy and troublemaking tendencies that young men have, and so they would make them do some things like at University of Connecticut, where I also worked, was then the Storrs Agricultural College. They decided that what they really needed to do was pick up rocks. So they made them, that was literally a school activity. You would go around and you would have to pick up rocks, and they cleared the land manually so that they could turn it into farmland. And then sooner or later they thought maybe picking up a football was a better idea than doing that. They had all kinds of exercise activities, and you had students that would, with time on their hands, do bad things. Princeton, for example, twice had its residence hall burned down by the students because they were mad about the food. Now that's, now we burn couches. Back then they burned dorms. There was a lot of misbehavior. There was a lot of energy. So students themselves, not the administration, not the faculty, students themselves, and then immediately thereafter alumni, took it on themselves to organize some games and start rowing and competing with each other inside the school. And then around the 1860s, after the war, schools started competing against each other and inviting rival schools to come and visit. It took off very, very fast, mostly around rowing and baseball and football. Basketball wasn't around yet, of course. And so they started playing these games against each other, and immediately people had concerns about them. Immediately, university leaders had concerns. The popular press had concerns. The citizenry at large had concerns. Well, and what could those have concerns been? Well, imagine this. If we were talking about the concerns of college sport, way too commercial, way too many commercial interests involved, way too much money involved, right? Students, people playing the games who aren't real students, they're not serious students, they're really not part of, the university. The rules being flaunted and cheating going on, and student safety. Those sound familiar? Exactly the case in the 1880s. Exactly the case in the 1880s. The first intercollegiate athletic event between two rival institutions that was ever recorded wasn't set up by the students. It was set up by a railroad promoter who was trying to figure out how to get people to buy tickets to ride on one of his new lines. So he thought, I bet if I can get Princeton and Yale to row against, actually it was Harvard and Yale, to row against each other, I can promote a big event, I'll sell tickets and I'll make money. First collegiate event was a commercial event for somebody to try and make money. Well, the students surely were serious students back then because everybody was a serious student then. There were no rules about who was going to play and not play. It was common practice in the late 1800s and even into the early 1900s for the professors themselves to be drafted by the president. Once presidents figured out you could raise money this way, they said to the faculty, you got to play on the football team. Scary thought, right? They made faculty play. They made anybody play. There's a very famous and hilarious now story about schools quickly figuring out how to promote themselves through athletics, right? University presidents like me, imagine that, thinking shamelessly about using sport to promote their institution. And next thing you know, they'll want to be on TV. The fact is that schools in the East and schools from the Midwest would frequently send their teams back to the Northeast to play against the Ivies and the schools that had big visibility in the mass markets in order to establish themselves as a brand, right? The word we'd use today. So Oregon sends its team back in the late 1800s to the Northeast to play 3 football games. They show up for the first game, and the team across the other line averaged about 35 years of age. Now they quickly figured out, gee, this doesn't look like a college team. Right? And they physically beat them up badly. I'll get around to that in a minute. Beat them up badly, and that was pretty insulting. It was a little more shocking when they went to the next school and there was the same team. And to add insult to injury, when they went to the third school, the same team. The alumni of the 3 schools had banded together, raised some money, gone to the docks in Boston, hired a bunch of guys to come play this game and beat up Oregon, which they did successfully, by the way. There were no rules. Anybody could play. The violence of the games, especially football, was stunning. Stunning. It was remarkable if you came out of a game without a broken bone, a broken nose, a serious injury. In 1904, 19 boys, young men, were killed playing football in America. Now, I always like to sort of normalize things to today. So if you normalize that today, there is probably 100 times more kids playing football today than then. But let's just say it was 10 times more today. That would be as if 190 kids died playing football this year. Died. Famously in a Princeton-Yale game, it's not clear who was the perpetrator. A kid got mad during a pile-up in a football game. He pulled a knife and stabbed a kid. Right? I mean, it was a brutal, physical game. And there were no set rules. You would go and you'd show up for a game, and then the captains would come together and they'd sit and they'd decide whose rules they were going to have. And they'd basically have a big argument about your rules, my rules, here's how we play the game, here's how we play the game. Got to remember that in the late 1860s, the first game of football that's claimed by football in America is also the same game claimed as the first soccer game and the first rugby game, right? Because there was no differentiation. The game looked kind of like rugby and sort of was crafted after kind of the rugby that was played in England, but everybody claims that same game as the first game because the three branches of sport went out from there. So the rules are still evolving and there's no safety. And then the other piece of it is people think that today college sport is all about money, just about making money, and used to be about the love of the game, and money was irrelevant. 1926, right? 1926, Yale's Athletic Association had a $450,000 profit that year on their total revenue. Fast forward to today's money, that's like about almost $5 million net profit off of its athletic program. That would rank it in the top 10 among all of our universities today in gross profit off of a net profit off of an athletic program. There was almost a riot one time because for a Princeton game, a big game, they decided to double the ticket price from 25 cents to 50 cents, which seems silly now, but of course, fast forward it, talking real money for a ticket then. The interesting thing about that game was still being organized. This was actually in the late 1800s, being organized by the students, and so the student manager of the football team was a very young entrepreneurial guy named Woodrow Wilson. You'd guess he was from Chicago because he managed to parlay that into President of the United States, right? So, only in a few places can you double ticket prices and still become President of the United States. It worked for him. The upshot of all of this was a huge, it's hard to overstate it, hue and cry in the mass media about the dangers of college sport on the front page, and then the invention of the sport page in the back page. So on the back page, it was all about come to the game, here's the exciting match, wasn't this fun, wasn't this exciting? On the editorial page was the president of the same university saying, we've got to stop this is awful. Fascinating moment, which has some interesting parallels to today. Harvard University is kind of at the middle of some of this story because Harvard had a huge football tradition. They would routinely, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, get 70, 80,000 people showing up for a game. Biggest college football game prior to the current era was here in Chicago. Army-Navy game. Imagine this, Army-Navy game in the mid-1920s, 110,000 people. 110,000 people showing up for a football game. No TV, no anything. 110,000 people for a college game, not a pro game. The pro programs were barely getting started and barely had audiences. It was all about college sport. So Harvard comes along, and they have a president named Charles Eliot, one of the most famous people for those of us who are academicians. He was president of Harvard more than 30 years, very distinguished scholar, and shaped a lot of what we now think of as the modern university. Charles Eliot also was on a mission from God to end football. He wanted to kill football in America, thought it was an awful thing, worked at it year in, year out. We can see he was not very successful. In fact, he wasn't successful on his own campus. He had a young, enterprising coach. Most of the coaches were young because they were only a few years off the team then. He had a young coach who did the only sensible thing for a coach. We got a few coaches here in the room. He ran around his president to his alumni, right? Sound familiar? Yeah. Ran around his president, went to the alumni, and he went to his best supporter of football, who happened to be a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, who happened to be president of the United States. Mr. President, you got to help me. They're trying to kill our beloved football. What do we do? And Teddy Roosevelt prudently said, paraphrasing, you mend it or I'll end it. he basically said, we got to fix this thing. We got to put rules around it. We got to make it safe. We got to make it fair. We got to make it fit our true values, our academic values, the values of educating young men at this point, and how that supports all of our values. We got to fix this. He has a conference, brings together some coaches, some athletic folks, and some presidents, and lo and behold, 24 months later, the NCAA is born. Those are our roots. So we were established to do essentially two things. Make sure that, first of all, we play by rules that are fair, that protect student athletes, and that support our values. The values of education, the values of integrity, the values that we want to imbue our young men and women with. And secondly, that we make sure that we do that in a way that's consistent with higher education. These are student athletes. These are not guys that we hire from the docks of Boston. These are our students. And they will be students, and they will play these games around the concept of collegiate athletics or amateurism. And those two funding principles are still what imbues what we do today. 100 and however many years that is, 6 years later. That's still what we're talking about. A year ago, August, I got together about a little over 50 university presidents from all around Division I. We met to talk about collegiate athletics in Division I in particular, what was working, what wasn't. If you remember, in 2011, my first year in this job, having left the presidency, I was president of the University of Washington, came to this job, got on the job, and it's like the whole world started exploding. We just had scandal after scandal after scandal, just boom, 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 boom. It's like a month that Bob Williams, my VP for communications here, he was coming to work in a flak jacket. It was a tough year, and then of course we had a lot of bigger challenges into this next year. So I wanted to get our presidents together and say, what are we doing? What is this all about? We spent 2 days in conversations, some of the 2 most interesting days I've had as an academic leader. And guess what? Without me giving that historical speech or even talking about the issues of college athletics, just turning them loose basically to talk about it, they came away and said, look, we got to do 2 things. We got to make sure that our student athletes are students, are real students, and that they're successful as students, because we know what the statistics are. They're not going to be professional athletes, all but less than 1% of them. They're going to be citizens. They're going to be teachers and doctors and lawyers and nurses and dentists, and they're going to do all the things that our graduates do. And we need to make sure that they're our students. They're not our employees, they're our students. And we take care of them, and we support them and nurture them in that role, and take care of their safety. And secondly, we all said, we got to make sure that we abide by the ethics and standards and integrity of the rest of higher education. If we want this to be a reflection of, as well as integrated into our university system, then let's make sure we're doing that. We came out of that conversation, launched a variety of new initiatives that are working their way through our quite complex process. We can talk about that in a second, because we're a very democratic organization. I'm not the czar of college sport. I'm not the commissioner of college sport. I'm the president of a collective association with 1,100 college and university presidents in it. My wife calls that payback. But don't think about Roger Goodell. Think about the Secretary General of the UN. You're just hurting this enterprise. And so we sit down and we say, look, let's start with the student athlete component. We know that we're doing much better now than we ever have in the academic success of our student athletes. I'll come back to that in a second. But we still had issues that we were concerned about. We still had pockets where we weren't doing nearly as well. And so we said, look, today having kids be Division I competitive athletes is an incredibly demanding role. It takes an enormous amount of time and energy. It's very hard to be a successful student athlete and a successful student. It's a big time job. It's really bad when you show up and you're not ready to be competitive in the classroom as well as on the court. Any basketball player knows they show up on campus, they better be in pretty good shape, they better have a good jump shot, they better have a good left hand. Well, they better have English and they better have math too. Because if you're not ready there, and now you're starting to play competitive ball and you're having to try and catch up on the academic side, you're way behind the curve. So we raised our initial eligibility standards, and we said, no, here's some new, we can talk about that in Q&A if you want, what we did. But we raised the initial eligibility standards and said, if you're going to come and you're going to play Division I sports, you have to have these skills and be at this level of preparation, and that's been passed and approved, and we're now working our way through the high schools with it right now. We secondly said we also want to send a message to all of our teams, all of our universities, all of our coaches, all of our ADs, that if you're going to be competitive as a team, you got to compete two ways. You got to win on the court or the field, and you got to win in the classroom. So we passed a very simple rule. We have this complex thing called an APR that measures academic progress, and we said your team has to be on track to graduate with an APR that predicts a 50% graduation rate. Now, that's not too high a bar, right? I mean, that ought to be a pretty minimal expectation. But half of your team needs to be clearly on track to graduate. And if it's not, you're not going to any NCAA postseason competition. Even if you're undefeated, doesn't matter. You're not going to any bowl games. Undefeated, doesn't matter. Number one in the country, doesn't matter. So if that standard had been in place last year, in our men's basketball tournament, Division I basketball tournament, 7 teams would not have been there. 7 teams would not have made that tournament. Some teams already they're not going to the tournament this year, even if they go undefeated. Doesn't matter. Last year, bowl games, 5 or 6 teams would not have played in bowl games that played in bowl games last year under this rule. And that rule is in effect now, right now. So there will be teams that will not, no matter what they do on the floor, they will not be in our postseason play. Those kids will be denied access to their athletic dream because they're not fulfilling what they need to do in the classroom. That sends a very important message. This is about students being students who play ball. And we want them to be the best athletes they can be. We want them to be successful. If they have the ability and the desire to be a professional athlete, fabulous. How do we deny them that? That's a wonderful dream. Let's help them go pursue their dream. But when they come to college, they're going to be a student. The second piece then, this integrity and ethics piece, we launched 2 new reforms. We split it into 2 branches. And first we said, look, obviously we have to follow our rules. And we've got to make sure that if you're playing by the rules, especially if you're a coach, that if you're playing by the rules, the last thing we want a coach to do is feel like she's being a chump because they're playing by the rules and their competitors are cheating and getting away with it. Right? I mean, that's the worst thing in the world, is where you know somebody's cheating, you know somebody's breaking the rules, you know somebody's got their toes over the line constantly, and then they're beating you, and then you think, well, man, am I like the dumbest person in the world? Do I need to cheat too? And you know, it's how it works in business, how it works in everything in life. So we said we've got to make sure that we have a penalty structure in place that when people violate rules, we can't have coaches or boosters or players or administrators sitting there thinking, doing a little cost-benefit analysis. Well, you know, it's okay to cheat because if I get caught, you know, the penalty really isn't a big deal anyway, and, you know, so what? And we're not likely to get caught. No, by the way, we'll win a bunch more games if we do this, or we'll get that kid if we do that. On Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, the Division I board will vote on a completely new penalty structure. I won't bore you with the details of it, but completely changes the nature of our penalties, and it dramatically ramps up the penalties on those things that we know people involved in sport care most about. Playing time, number of recruits that they have, scholarship opportunities, money. And it focuses penalties on those things and says, look, you violate our most important rules, these things are going to happen to you. Do not sit there and do that cost-benefit analysis. You won't like the outcome. And we're going to accelerate the speed with which we process cases and the speeds with which they're adjudicated by changing a variety of things. And that, unless I miss my bet, I'm a little superstitious, will pass, I think, unanimously on the Division I board next Tuesday, roll out and take effect next summer. So we've made big changes there. And then the other piece of the integrity component is we also, in talking with coaches and players and a variety of other people, we know that some of our rules are just plain silly. I mean, we have a rule book that's for Division I that's about 450 pages long. There's some parts of it that are just almost vacuous. There's some parts that have rules that don't make any common sense in the 21st century. We have the vast majority of them make great sense. But we're working through the rule book right now with a committee that's being led by the president of Clemson University and a group of coaches and ADs and others to try and find a way to make sure that the rules that we codify actually serve student athletes and actually make sense. So what am I talking about? Well, we have rules, for example, right now that address recruiting prospective student athletes and the kind of communication you can have with them, including the kinds of mailing you can send out to them. So we have a couple of pages in this rule book that says you can send mailings, limits the number of things you can mail to a prospective student athlete, and here's the size of the envelope. 4 inches this way and 5 inches this way. I mean, it describes it to the quarter inch. The envelope can be no bigger than this. It can have no more than 3 colors on it. Good rule. It's a good rule. It tells you how many pages can go in the envelope. It tells you how many colors you can have on the pages that go in the envelope. 3, by the way, in case you were wondering. It tells you how big the fold-out that you might put in the envelope can be and how big it can fold out to and how many colors can be on the fold-out that goes in the envelope that's only this big. Now, I'm sure when that rule was written it made some sense. But for the life of me, I can't figure out why we have compliance directors at Division I schools measuring envelopes to make sure that a coach isn't cheating on the size of an envelope. That's just silliness. We have rules that say that coaches can email but can't text prospective student athletes. Now, at the risk of hurting someone's feelings in the room, I don't see any 17-year-olds, but I can't see the back. But if you have 17-year-olds at home or 12-year-olds, if you email, I know if I email 17-year-olds, they'll usually call me a day or two later and say, you do understand I don't read email, I text. Right? Email to them is sort of like chiseling in stone and putting it on a camel and sending it over to you. They text. Now, the rule was put in place because 10 years ago or so, if you remember, texting cost money. When you received the text, it went on your bill. And so moms were getting a bill at the end. The kid's getting recruited by a bunch of coaches, and they get a bill, and there's $120 worth of bills on there for text messages, and they say, what's this all about? Well, we passed the rule, and then, of course, we realized that the world had changed, and now everybody texts. And so we've got to go back and just clean up some of that stuff that doesn't make sense. We put very interesting constraints on coaches about the number of times they can send an email, the number of times they can call them. We relaxed those rules this summer on basketball coaches, men's basketball coaches. And guess what? We haven't received a single complaint from a student that says, I'm getting harassed to death. I haven't figured out how harassment is a good recruitment strategy. We're just behind the curve. So we're changing all those rules. And what are we focusing on? We're trying to focus on the things that really matter, the things that our moms taught us, right? You don't lie. You don't cheat on the rules of play. You don't cheat in the classroom. You don't take money from people. You don't hang out with the bad guys. And trying to codify those things that are genuinely threats to the integrity of the sport. Get people to worry about that. That's what causes all of you, when you're reading the sports page, to get upset. I've never had someone call me up and say, I'm really glad you nailed that guy for too many phone calls. I have had people call up and say, why are you letting this guy do that or this do that, or cheating in a classroom, or a student taking money, or something that's actually a serious threat to integrity of college sport. That's what we're focusing on. Those efforts are all moving forward very, very rapidly, and by this time next year, all of them will be in place and will have shifted the landscape back to those core values of what we're about. In the meantime, how are we doing? Because a lot of people, when they hear talk about college sport or the NCAA or NCAA sports, there's so much of it that's negative out there in the media that it causes, I think, a huge misperception of what our student athletes and our coaches really do. And it just frustrates the heck out of me. First of all, when you talk about, to the average sort of person out there, about college sport, they draw their inferences about college sport from what they see on TV or read in the paper, which is really the coverage on about 25 Division I football teams and about maybe 50 Division I men's basketball teams. And that's it. And they see that because that's what gets covered and played up, and that's what we talk about. And that's great. Those are wonderful sports, and they're very exciting. But that is a tiny, tiny fraction of what college sport is about. And they conclude from that all of the information that they believe about college sport. There are around 450,000 young men and women playing college sport right now. Not, the 5,500 of them are playing Division I basketball. 50 of those will go to the NBA. So they see the one and dones going to the NBA, and there's 10 or 12 of those every year, and they say, oh, that's college sport. There's another 450,000 that are staying in school, that are graduating, that are doing all the right things. They say, well, you know, kids aren't really serious about going to school. They just want to go to school so they can get to the NBA or the NFL or professional tennis or wherever they want to go. And they're not really good students. In fact, they're bad students. Here's the reality of that. At all three of our divisions, 1, 2, and 3, little schools, middle-sized, big schools, student athletes at virtually every college and university in America have higher graduation rates than the rest of the student body. Almost everywhere. Well, yeah, but that's because you count the women. Well, yeah, it does count the women, right? But when you separate men and women, guess what? The men graduate at higher rates than the men, and the women graduate at higher rates than the women. Well, yeah, but when you segregate by race, I bet it doesn't work. Absolutely the same thing. African American students have higher graduation rates on campuses than their non-athlete counterparts. In fact, African American males have almost a 12 percentage point higher graduation rate than the non-athletes on almost all of our Division I campuses. College athletics isn't the problem about academics. In many places, it's the cure. It's part of the solution. Students have better structure. They have people watching over the top of them. They have coaches saying you're staying eligible, right? You're doing your grades. They've got, in many ways, a very admirable academic model. At every university I've ever been, I always wished I could give the whole student body the academic experience that our student athletes had, the kind of support we provided them, the kind of mentoring and, frankly, nagging that they get from a coach or from an academic advisor in an athletic department who sits on top of them to make sure they're doing what they need to do. It's a completely different model than the one people have in their heads. The other bit of mythology that people get because they focus on those handful of football teams and those handful of basketball programs is that this is all about money. Everybody's awash in money. I've talked to more audiences that believe the only reason any college ever plays sport is because they make so much money at it. DePaul is just rolling in dough because of its women's basketball team. Right? Not hardly. True, Doug? You got enough to give Doug a raise. That's right. No, but here's the facts. The facts are that out of the 1,100 colleges and universities last year, around 20 of those 1,100 schools had positive cash flow from their athletic program. Around 20. Well, how can that be? Look at these big contracts. Look at how many, there's 100,000 people at a football game. You got Notre Dame. What's Notre Dame get? 90,000 people for a game or whatever you get, and they're all there and they're all spending money. And how could that possibly be? Well, here's the part of college sport people don't fully understand, and there's no reason they would. If this was a business enterprise and this was all about money, there would only be 2 sports in colleges in America. There would be football and there would be men's basketball. And there would be half as many football teams because half of them lose money. And there would be a quarter as many basketball teams because most of the basketball teams lose money. There would be no women's sports. There would be no Olympic sports because those are all money losers. You wouldn't do that. So sure, most universities in Division I, especially those that you see on TV, have, if you want to put it in business terms, positive cash flow from football. And they take that money and they use it to support everything else. When I was at the University of Washington, huge rowing program, won a bunch of national championships, and people would say, so Dr. Emmert, what can we do to support the rowing team? And I'd say, buy football tickets. What about women's basketball? Buy football tickets. What about gymnastics? Buy football tickets. Because that's what pays for everything. That's what drives everything. Some men's basketball programs, some, have positive cash flow, and that helps pay for all the rest of the program. Well, doesn't that seem unfair? Why should football have to pay for gymnastics? Well, here's the other thing that happens in college athletics. It's like most other things in the world. In the college academic environment, the same thing obtains. Nobody in America, no university president in America, if we were running on a cash business basis, would ever have a music school. Music schools are huge money losers. Think of the business model of a music school. One professor, one student teaching you how to play the trumpet. It's a terrible business model. But I also can't imagine a university without a music department or a music school. So to be a full university, you have a music school. Nursing, big time money loser. Nursing, it's awful. It's god-awful business. But I sort of like nurses when I'm sick, right? Engineering, Bad business model for engineering. Dentistry, the world's worst. Should never be any dentists out there. You'll lose money on dental schools. It's a terrible model. Well, how do you run them then? Because psychology makes a lot of money. Sociology is a great business model. One professor, 200 students, 40 students, great business model, no laboratories, no expensive equipment, right? Simple games like, soccer, great game, right? Very inexpensive to run, but great revenue. So what do the presidents and the deans do? They take the money from those programs to subsidize all the other, because they don't run a sociology department, they run universities. And universities have music, and they have nursing, and they have engineering, and they have everything around them, and biology labs. So there's all these cross subsidies that go on. So when people focus on the top 25 football teams, they're looking at this tiny little slice of the world, and they're saying, oh my God, look, every coach makes $5 million. There's a number of coaches here. All the coaches that make $5 million, please raise your hand. Right? Well, there's 3 in America. Right? That's not what the model looks like. The volleyball coaches, there's no $5 million volleyball coaches. There's no $5 million women's basketball coaches. There's not very many $5 million coaches, period. But that's what the world sees, and that's the attention they get, and that's just not the reality. So when you hear about college sport and someone say, oh, college sport's all about this, all about that, the first thing you should ask is, well, what college sport are you talking about? Well, you know. No, I don't know, actually. What sport are you talking about? Well, Notre Dame football. Okay, that's pretty successful, pretty darn good. Did you mean DePaul basketball? It's very successful, great tradition, great tradition in soccer and softball and women's basketball, and they do real bit. But it's very different than the 25 teams, football teams you see on Saturday on TV. Tiny slice of it. College sport has big issues, and we're working hard on them, and we're going to address those issues, and we're not going to back away from them. But don't let those issues taint what is an extraordinary experience for 99.5% of our student athletes. Go spend some time with a student athlete, get to meet them, get to know what they're doing. You'll come away saying, wow, this is a really good thing for America. Thank you very much for having me here today. I enjoyed being with you.
Very good speech, what you would expect from a political science major. I mean, to be blunt about it, that was not a surprise. We have several questions. Before we go, our speaker mentioned it, but we do have the basketball coach from the DePaul University's men's team, Oliver Purnell. Oliver, why don't you raise your hand? And we also have the coach of the women's basketball team, Doug Bruno, who I believe has his gold medal with him, that he was assistant coach in London with the women's basketball team.
Can I give a DePaul plug? So as you may know, I was over in London this year and went over with USA Basketball and actually spent some time with Doug and the women's team. And your coach was fabulous. They obviously came back with a gold medal, but all of those women, all of those men, they represented our country so magnificently, not just on the court. I got to see them all over town, and the way they interacted with people, it was pretty special. Good job, Doug. That was pretty cool.
There you go. Though you're a former provost and a university president, you're going to have to give really short answers.
I can do it.
We have a lot of questions.
I can do it.
And we have our turnout time. And the old professor has a question, which I'll be saving for last because we could end this right now with my question. So let me go. Sam Stark, Chicago Sports Commission. Where are you, Sam? Raise your hand. There you are. I don't know what the Chicago Sports Commission is, but I assume it's legit? Good. Okay. The City Club, you know. By the way, if it wasn't legit, we'd still read your questions. Don't worry about it. We start off with a sandbag, Mr. President. Will the men's Final Four leave football stadiums and return to basketball arenas like the United Center?
Very unlikely to in the foreseeable future. Now, we, as many of you may know, we've committed a number of years back to playing in football arenas. We can get great big crowds in them. We're playing in the Georgia Dome this year, and then we go over to Dallas to play in the Cowboys Stadium the following year. The bad news is that restricts pretty dramatically the cities that we could bid for, it. So I think it would be a really good idea for you to put a dome over the football stadium, and then we're here. Yeah, we're not exploring that yet.
Okay. Stephen, is that Shucker? Where are you, Stephen? Raise your hand. Okay, Columbia College. Remember, this is the city club. We recognize all universities. Do you see any way the death penalty will be given to a collegiate program? Oh boy, it's a tough question. And if so, what set of circumstances would have to occur?
Well, I think it's important to know that the Committee on Infractions, so under normal circumstances, which is 99% of the time, all of the judgments that are handed out to a university aren't made by me or one of my staff. They're made by something called a Committee on Infractions. That's basically a jury of your peers. It's a group of commissioners and ADs and lawyers who are not part of college sport who hear the complaints. The university or coach comes in and they describe their side of the story, and then they pass judgment and they met out whatever penalties are consistent with the NCAA rules. And the death penalty is called a death penalty because it basically means you will suspend play in that sport, whatever the sport is, for some period of time. I certainly hope we don't see it, because if we do, it means somebody did something really egregious, and I would prefer to not have that occur. It's only happened once, by the way, in football, and that was SMU back in the 80s. It is certainly still a tool that's available to that committee, and they could, in fact, use it. And I don't want to say what the circumstances would be by which they do it, but they have it available to them, and they may well do it sometime if the facts warranted it.
Well, here's a follow-up, and I guess you could have guessed this question. Our pal Lester Munson. Where are you, Lester? Raise your hand.
Right hand back.
There you are. Well, okay. I know you're ready for this, so here we go. The settlement with Penn State did not include the death penalty. Why not? Is the death penalty now eliminated as a sanction?
Yeah. So, the Penn State case was extraordinary and unprecedented in so many ways, most of them bad. And so the solution that was crafted to that case was equally unprecedented. We've never in our history done anything quite like that, where we had a case, I'm trying to be brief, where we had a case where the facts were undisputed, where the board had said, yep, those are the facts that came out of that free report, a massive inquiry that was conducted by them, far deeper than anything we could have done with our investigative teams. And we reached the consent decree that imposed the penalties and sanctions, as you know. The way that was handled, though, was my discussing what the penalties should be with the committee on, not the Committee on Infractions, but the Division I board presidents and the executive committee presidents. Those are basically my bosses. So that means about 25 university presidents from all across the United States. We spent a great deal of time, as you can imagine, working through all of the options. We discussed at great length whether or not the death penalty was a proper fit to this particular circumstance. In the end, we concluded it wasn't, in large part because of the collateral damage. Again, in this particular case, it would have been imposed on people that were essentially innocent bystanders, right? So this case had nothing to do with the marching band. It had nothing to do with the mom and pop hotel and motel in State College. It had nothing to do with the guy who sells hot dogs, and all of whom would have been profoundly impacted by a multi-year ban on football in State College. What we wanted was to say, look, you've got some fundamental culture problems here. We want you to focus on fixing those. So take your mind off of going to bowl games. Don't worry about championships or the Rose Bowl. You're not going for 4 years. Worry about the culture that's emerged around this. You can still play ball. You can still enjoy a Saturday in State College, Pennsylvania, but focus on getting the culture right. And we put in place a number of other things to monitor and assess their culture changes as they go along. So we reached, I think, out of a very difficult circumstance, the right conclusion. But bear in mind, there's no happy story here. This is just an awful mess. And we crafted the best outcome that we could possibly come up with, and we all feel positive about what we did. We feel awful that it had to happen.
Okay, this will be the last question on Penn State, and,
I doubt it.
No, at least from me. I mean, I think you're going to cover it all. We have a gentleman here named Devin Patterson. Where are you, sir? Right over here. Okay. Hey, Devin. Devin is a father of a Penn State alumnus, a student athlete who worked hard to win the class in the classroom and on the field. Why did the NCAA decide to punish innocent student athletes by vacating their 112 victories?
Yeah, well, we weren't trying to punish students, or I've had people say, well, why did you punish Coach Paterno? Those penalties weren't about, the vacation of the wins wasn't about the students or the coach per se. It was about the program. It was about the university. And for those of you that didn't follow this, the committees agreed that we should vacate from our records the wins from the time when the first known abuse occurred, and there was evidence of that first known abuse at the university, and they didn't address it then. The problem, of course, is you can't go back in time and say, well, okay, if this had emerged, what would that have done? I mean, what would that have looked like, and how would that have impacted things? And the committee felt pretty strongly, and I agreed with them, that we needed to send a message that having failed to deal with this over that extended period of time has consequences. I hope that a student who played on the field doesn't feel like that wonderful game that they played and that great experience they had was for naught. They had that experience, they won that game, they went to that bowl game, they won that bowl game. It's just not going to show up in an NCAA record book. And you know, it was a difficult consequence. We worked very hard to try and not impact students, current students. It's why we allowed students to transfer and play immediately. So very positively, only 8 kids chose to do that. I thought that was a great testament to the new coaching staff and to their commitment to the university, and was a very good thing, because they could have had a lot of people run for the corners, and they didn't. They stayed with the program. I think I like what I'm seeing there. The new leadership at Penn State, I think, is doing a terrific job. The new president, Roger Erickson's a great guy. He's in a tough situation. He's doing well. The vast majority of the board leadership's just spot on. This is a wonderful, wonderful university, extraordinary academic institution, great proud tradition across the board. They need to, and they are now, just dealing with it, saying, okay, we get what happened now. Let's fix this and go forward and get back to where we have been, not just around football, but in everything. And your son should be very proud of that university. It's a great place.
Just a few more questions. Lou Collins, a former university president, which, by the way, is a great honor. See if the crowd's with us, or if they're still mulling over the Penn State thing. Lou Collins, as you figure a university president would ask this question, why doesn't the NCAA limit coaches' salaries just like it limits scholarship amounts?
Oh, because we'd be in court the next day.
Good answer.
Right. So we have some lawyers in the room. So there's actually, first of all, we at one time, the NCAA, this is long before I was in my job, the NCAA had a rule that had restricted earnings on some part-time coaching staff, had a big lawsuit, was a class action lawsuit, probably got people here that can cite that case, lost. It was a very expensive lawsuit. It was a demonstration that that principle just doesn't work. And so we do not have control over, and have not asserted control over, coaches' salaries. The only thing we control on scholarships isn't the value of the scholarship, other than to say it's limited to tuition fees, room and board, and books and supplies. There's an active debate, very active debate right now, of whether or not schools should be allowed to add to that something we call a miscellaneous expense allowance, which is the true cost of attendance. There'd be a couple $1,000s more that could go into those scholarships. But the scholarship is limited to the legitimate, verifiable costs of being a student, because it's critical that we differentiate between the fact that these are students versus employees. I don't know a university president, current or former, that wants to convert our student athletes to employees. That's not what this is about. If you want to play professional sport, great, go play professional sport. That's fine. We've got lots of opportunities. But you come to us, you're going to be a student.
Okay. Very quickly, John Vergosen. Oh, right there, the Chicago Sports Commission. I'm telling you, you guys are...
it's a cabal.
Yeah, pretty soon. Yeah, well, give us a little, who in the hell are you? Okay.
God, this is a tough crowd.
Yes, very good questions, I'll say that. Yeah. A number of colleges have dropped varsity programs for the so-called low revenue generation. How can we prevent this from occurring in the future?
Buy football tickets.
Good answer. Joyce.
Look, I'm one of the guys that did that. So when I was at the University of Washington, we eliminated our swimming program. men's and women's. And it was a very, very painful thing to do. We had great, wonderful kids that come there. We had terrific coaching staff. But it was 2008. I laid off 550 employees. We had to cut about $3 million out of the athletic budget. It was a hard time. And so we just had to stop and make decisions like every business person does. You have to stop and make a decision. What can we afford and what can't we afford? We weren't competitive. We would have had to put a lot more money into it. We honored all the scholarships of those kids. The ones who wanted to transfer, we made sure they had waivers under NCAA rules so they could go somewhere else and swim. We helped get them placed. We helped our coaches get jobs. They were great coaches and they got snapped up right away. So we minimized the damage to it, but we had to make some decisions. There's this illusion that all athletic programs in America are awash in money, and it's just not true. The vast majority of schools have to subsidize their athletic program from money from the rest of the university. And when money from the rest of the university gets tight, they have to make tough decisions. And I hate that because we're all about opportunity. The good news is there's more kids playing sport than ever. The good news is there's more money being provided in scholarship support to students than ever before. More than $2 billion in scholarship money in sports will go to students in America this year, more than anything but the federal government. It's huge. It's wonderful support, but at some places it's tough. It's hard.
Okay, well, actually, my question will be the one that'll end it. Believe me, it'll end it.
You got the microphone.
Well, it makes no difference. We have two medical questions. First, from Joy Saxon, board member. Is the NCAA doing enough to prevent the serious impact of football concussions?
Yeah, well, we're certainly working very. Where's the questioner?
Joyce, there she is.
We're working really hard on it, Joy, and we're doing it in conjunction, of course, not surprisingly, with the NFL and with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has a lot of interest in concussion injuries. One of the things that's come out of our two recent wars experiences is that they're doing a great job protecting bodies, but heads are still a challenge to protect, and so we're getting lots of concussive injuries in the military. We were the first, we the NCAA were the first to create rules about how to handle suspected concussions, holding people out, making sure they get appropriate medical attention before they get reinserted. That's having a very positive impact, it looks like. We've been working with Roger Goodell and I, in fact, have been working with state legislatures, and I think Illinois has passed this, to get rules like that in place at every state for high school and Pewee and Pop Warner football. So we've got similar kinds of rules around concussive injuries issues. We just, a week ago, hired, for the first time ever, I created a job of chief medical officer for the NCAA. There hadn't been one. So I just hired a guy who was the chief medical officer for the U.S. Tennis Association to be ours, to work with all of our universities to conduct research programs and do as good of assessment as we can. The best medical research activity in the world goes on inside our members. Hospitals, our universities are where the work gets done. So we're focusing, Big Ten, by the way, and this neck of the woods is doing great work with us too, are focusing on how we can get as much research done, how we can change rules. We moving the kickoff line to reduce open field tackles, trying to work on the rules around head-to-head contact. You've seen this year, for example, when a young man in football has his helmet pop off, they got to go out for a play. That's all about training students to keep their helmets on, because that's usually the kid trying to loosen up their helmet, because a well-fitting helmet's not a comfortable thing. And so they loosen them up a little bit and they pop off. So we're trying to change some of those rules, but we'll stay on top of that again and again and again until we know that we've got the best solutions possible. We're also working on other injuries. Now, we know, for example, that young women, and this is true with girls in middle and high school, are blowing ACLs way too much. Young girls in knees are having all kinds of knee problems. We don't know why. So we got to do a lot of research and figure out, can we improve training? Can we do something in the way we conduct those sports that protects young women's knees? And so we're paying a lot of attention, and we're adding even more resources to that whole arena.
Last major question from Raymond Asher. Raymond, where are you? Raise your hand. That back there. Little Heroes Pediatric Cancer Foundation. Okay, member of the City Club. Basically, what is the NCAA? What is the NCAA doing about the whole question of steroid abuse or doping?
Yeah, so we do testing. Well, first of all, we have oversight over all of that. We run 89 national championships across all three of our our conferences, all three of our divisions. And when our athletes come into any of those championships, we do a whole drug testing regimen, and we require throughout the year that colleges and universities have a policy on drug testing, and then we hold them accountable for that. The data that we have right now remarkably suggests that we don't have as big a problem around steroid and a variety of drug performance-enhancing drugs as do professional sport. We have no evidence that we have the issues like the blood doping and the issues that, of course, Lance Armstrong and others have been tangled up in. But we stay on top of it pretty aggressively. We have an organization that conducts all those tests for us all around the country. We also work with universities and almost, well, I shouldn't say it that way. The vast majority of universities and colleges also have testing regimens around so-called recreational drugs. That is often a bigger issue in athletics than our performance-enhancing drugs. So we're very cognizant of it and try to stay on top of it. But it's a challenge because it's a moving target, as we see with the USOC and everyone else who works in that arena.
Okay, my last question, you don't have to answer this because, Coach Purnell's going to like this question. Trust me, you're going to like this question.
What,
Student
so should we give them seating right now?
No. Well, that would help. You're in Chicago. You talk about student athletes. Go to class, do better.
Yeah.
My question is just a simple statement. The University of Kentucky basketball team.
Yeah.
Explain. When you recruit and they last a year, if they don't go to class, who cares?
Yeah. Well, you're talking about the one and done rule.
One and done, yes.
Yeah,
and they call them student athletes is kind of an oxymoron.
I happen to agree with you.
Well, hell.
We're
that
done.
was the clincher.
We're done. So let me, this is a very important point that the coaches will appreciate. First of all, let me explain the so-called one and done rule. We don't have even a legal capacity, I don't think. I'm not a lawyer. We got, again, a bunch of lawyers here, to mandate that a student stay in school. You can't say, thou shalt stay in school for X number of years, right? The one and done rule isn't our rule, it's the NBA's rule. So the NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, they're the ones that say, in order to come play in our league, you have to meet these standards. So for the NFL, they say, we will only take you after 3 years of college. You cannot come join us for 3 years. So there's no such thing as a one and done in college because they can't go to the NFL. They won't take them. So everybody stays at least 3 years and then they go. In baseball, I like the baseball rule a lot. In baseball, they say, if you're good enough to play right out of high school, if it's 17, you can hit a curveball, come play for us. We'll sign you. We'll send you to Vidalia or somewhere, and then a few years later you'll make it. You'll be a Tiger, right? You get to play for the Tigers. Maybe right from Vidalia to the Tigers. Who knows? But the rule says if you go to college and play, you got to stay 3 years. The NBA says go to college 1 year, we'll take you. So what that's done is it's promoted an environment where someone who thinks they are capable of going to the NBA early or has somebody whispering in their ear convincing them they're that good, they come to school thinking, all right, I'm going to just kind of pass through here. I got to touch this base. I really don't want to go to college, but I have to do that to go pursue my dream. I think that's an anathema to the collegiate model, and I wish that the NBA would change it. I've been very clear about it. And we're having good conversations with them about changing it, but that is embodied in their collective bargaining agreement. That's not something that we want to have happen.
So you couldn't say you could not get a basketball scholarship unless you stayed 2 years? You couldn't do that?
We've never pressed that legal issue.
Well, I'm not available. Okay, how about a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Mark,
Thank you very much.